America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. And for today's episode, I will be looking at Elements of Pantheism, A Spirituality of Nature and the Universe by Paul Harrison. This book is from 1999, I believe. Let me double check that. Third edition is from 2013. First edition is from 1999, so that counts. This book is written in 1999. So it fills my requirement that I recently imposed, and I'm almost inevitably going to violate, that I'm only doing stuff from prior to the 21st century. Just makes it in under the deadline. So, Elements of Pantheism is a short book. It's less than 100 pages. And the author, Paul Harrison, was, at the time of this publication, the founder and president of the World Pantheist Movement. So, major figure, major voice in international pantheism. And I like pantheism, and I think that I consider myself a pantheist. Although I disagree with Harrison on a number of points in this book that I'm going to be looking at in closer detail. First, I'll go over, I think, the stuff that I agree with him on, although I'm sure I'll find stuff that I disagree with all the way through. But I want to recall for a moment the last episode, because there are some points that I brought up in looking at Nietzsche's book, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, that I want to now apply to this book a little bit. Like, primarily, the idea of being and becoming, and the contrast between Heraclitus and Parmenides that I looked at in the last book. Just as a quick refresher, I definitely think that you should go listen to that episode. But basically, Parmenides, there's this conflict that Anaximander had proposed both being and becoming as kind of realms of reality. And then Heraclitus was like, nah, the only thing that exists is becoming, changing, coming to be and passing away, a multiplicity of things coming into the world, struggling against one another and passing away. And that's, you can't step in the same river twice. That was Heraclitus. And then Parmenides was like, no, there's no becoming, everything is being. The only thing that exists is what exists. It doesn't change from one thing to another. It doesn't have any particulars that would come to be and then end. And so he was very much like kind of dismissing all change and all separation as illusion, and a real oneness of what was the true reality. So that was kind of the idea of everything being an illusion, and a dedication to oneness, I guess, would be the short and sweet version of Parmenides. He was more a bit of an absolutist, I think, than Heraclitus. But nevertheless, we're going to kind of set them as poles apart from one another. And Parmenides can kind of be the monist pole, whereby we just consider him as the ultimate in belief in the oneness of things, the oneness of reality. And let's set Heraclitus as the opposite pole, who would be, the advocate of the absolute multiplicity of things, the perpetual change, whereas Parmenides is like the perpetual changelessness, the eternalness. And let's set them as sort of poles apart from one another, of the monist on one end with the Parmenidean mindset, and the pluralist on the other end with the Heraclitean mindset. And then I want to use that dichotomy between those two philosophers and those two ideas, set even as extremes beyond where they themselves stood, to look at this distinction between monism and pluralism as it applies to pantheism. But to start with, I want to just go at the very beginning on the first page when he defines what pantheism is, in a rough sense. He defines it a little bit later. I'll look at a couple of his definitions, but the first definition he drops at the very beginning, when he says, what is pantheism? He says, the word pantheism derives from the Greek words pan, all, and theos, God. Literally, pantheism means all is God. In essence, pantheism holds that the universe, as a whole, is worthy of the deepest reverence, and that only the universe and nature are worthy of that degree of reverence. The statement, "Nature is my God," is perhaps the simplest way of summarizing the core pantheist belief, with the word God here meaning not a supernatural being, but the object of deepest personal reverence. Pantheism is a spiritual path that reveres and cares for nature, a spiritual path that joyously accepts this life as our only life and this earth as our only paradise if we look after it. Pantheism revels in the beauty of nature and the night sky and is full of wonder at their mystery and power. Pantheism believes that all things are linked in a profound unity. All things have a common origin and a common destiny. All things are interconnected and interdependent. In life and in death, we humans are an inseparable part of this unity. And in realizing this, we can find our joy and our peace. End quote. And then he goes on a little bit to talk about some other stuff. But just as that short section, he basically says, "Nature is my God" is the simplest way of summarizing it. Only the universe and nature are worthy of that degree of reverence. So, basically, worshiping nature as all that is. Now, he does say something here. He says, the universe and nature are worthy of that degree of reverence. But there's sort of a difference between the universe and nature. Those are two different words, and they have slightly two different meanings. And are both of those things worthy of that degree of reverence separately? Is one of them primary over the other? How does that play out? I'm going to be looking at the definition of pantheism in detail. The next section I'm going to look at, I'm going to jump forward to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the core beliefs, reverence of the universe. And so my quotes are not really exact quotes. I kind of skip over any part where he goes off on a tangent for the purpose of brevity. But I'm trying not to make any material changes to his meaning. I want to be as close to his meaning and just kind of cut out things that don't really, that just for the sake of brevity, that aren't core to his point. But when I say quote, I basically mean that, I'm reading from the book, and then when I say end quote, I'm no longer reading from the book. But it's not always an exact quote, I guess is what I'm saying. So anyway, just a real brief section here at the beginning of Chapter 4, when he says, quote, "Two core sentiments lie at the heart of pantheism. First, all pantheists feel that the universe is in some sense worthy of the deepest reverence. Second, and they accept that the universe is in important senses a unified whole of which all individual things are interdependent parts. For pantheists, there is no part of God held in reserve, somewhere beyond the edge of time and space. The object of pantheist reverence did not precede the universe, it does not extend outside the universe, it is not greater than the universe. When we use the word universe here with a capital, we include any other universes beyond the one we can see with our instruments that science may one day reliably demonstrate. These would still be part of the omniverse, the totality of everything that exists." End quote. Okay, so those are the core beliefs. He says two core sentiments lie at the heart of pantheism. He lists those first and second ones. First one, he says all pantheists feel the universe is in some sense worthy of the deepest reverence. So there he specifically says the universe. He doesn't say nature. So the universe seems to be what he prioritizes as the thing which is most worthy of reverence is the universe with capital U. And then the second one, he says, they accept that the universe is in important senses a unified whole of which all individual things are interdependent parts. Now this is the part that I want to talk about a little bit more because he's saying that the universe is one thing. It's a unified whole. So it seems like the unity and the oneness of the universe is a core part of pantheism. It's a unified whole of which all the individual things are interdependent parts. So he prioritizes the universe as one thing, and then the individual separate parts of it, are kind of like secondary. It's like it is a unified whole of which all individual things are interdependent parts. It's comprised of those things, but it clearly seems to be set out as more than just the sum of its parts, and in an important way, a unified thing, one universe. So you could say from that sense that even the universe as a concept is a monistic concept, more so than it's a pluralistic concept. It's closer to the Parmenidean view of reality than the Heraclitean. It's monistic. It's one thing, more so than its many interdependent parts. Okay? So it seems to me that in that statement, the author comes down on the side of monism, more so than pluralism. And he basically says that pantheism is, at core, a monistic belief system. It's core to pantheism to have that monistic view of the universe. I would dispute that. I consider myself a pantheist, but I consider myself more close to Heraclitus in being a pluralist. I think that the many things are prominent in the world, more so than the oneness of everything. And so I consider myself in that way a pluralist, and I think that nature expresses itself in a pluralistic way. And so if you worship nature, then you should worship the pluralistic expression of nature, more so than some sort of oneness that you would have to contemplate through some Parmenidean meditation. It's not as apparent, it's not as immediate, the oneness of things. It's like you have to kind of dig through the world conceptually to uncover a oneness. But it's when you open your eyes and look around, it's not the oneness that you would describe, but you would describe the many things. So let me jump from there to his further discussion. I'm actually going to jump. That was chapter 4. I'm going to jump to chapter 8, which is one of the last chapters. When he talks about pantheist controversies, souls, bodies, and death. So here's talking about splits and differences between pantheistic movement. And his discussion of souls and bodies and death and those sort of discussions, he's talking about reincarnation, and he really kind of sets up some discussions about the particulars about, human beings and what we are and do we have souls and stuff as being distinctions within pantheism. But there are a couple other distinctions within pantheism that he doesn't talk about as much, that are the ones that I want to kind of suss out of what he's written, look through what he's written and see, like the dualism, monism. He doesn't talk about, or he talks about dualism, but I mean the pluralism, monism, I should say, of Heraclitus and Parmenides. He doesn't really talk about that pluralism, monism thing. He just falls down real quick on the side of monism, like puts down his marker, if you will, on that side of the equation, asserts it as a fundamental part of pantheism, kind of makes some bit of an explanation as to why, and he sort of makes a bit of a nod of the head to the pluralistic view, as you saw in what I read earlier. But he doesn't really discuss it as an ongoing debate. He just kind of asserts that, well, this is what pantheists are. But I think it is or should be an ongoing debate. But so I want to look at one split he makes here in three different parts of pantheism: the dualist, the physicalist, and the idealist pantheist. He talks about those three, and I want to read to you what he says about that right here. He says, quote, "Pantheism has never been a united church, so it has never suffered a true schism as such, but it is a very diverse church, and within the diversity there are some major points of difference. The deepest division relates to the questions of whether spirit, soul, and matter-body are two separate substances, dualism, or simply aspects of a single substance, monism. Closely related to this is a division over whether the universe is purely physical or whether it has a spiritual aspect, a kind of cosmic soul or intelligence. Thus, we have three main types of pantheism. First, dualist pantheism believes that spirit and matter are two completely different substances, and that the soul is to some extent separate from the body and can survive the body's death. Second, physicalist pantheism holds that there is only one fundamental substance, matter/energy, and that the mind is a property of matter. Third, for idealist pantheism, the one basic substance is mind, or consciousness, and matter is simply a creation or delusion of mind. In the East, idealist pantheism is common, found in many schools of Buddhism and Hinduism. Physicalist and dualist pantheisms are the major forms in the West today. We will examine these three schools in turn, beginning with the physicalist version. Philosophical materialism, today often referred to as physicalism, simply means belief that there is only one basic form of substance, matter/energy. The idea of what matter is has changed over time and usually means whatever science considers as material. This includes all forms of energy, antimatter, as well as invisible forms and fields known through their measurable effects, and as yet unidentified forms of matter such as dark matter. The physicalist form of pantheism has been known under many different names: scientific pantheism, religious naturalism, religious humanism, religious atheism, positive atheism, materialist monism, cosmotheism. All of these are extremely similar, if not identical, in their basic beliefs. Scientific physicalist pantheism is close to the roots of Western pantheism in the early Greek philosophers, from Thales to Heraclitus. Zeno, the founder of the Stoics, thought that it was totally impossible that something incorporeal could have any effects. Only a body is capable of acting or being acted upon. The Stoics believed that the soul was a very refined form of matter. It is also close to the thought of John Toland, who coined the word pantheist. Toland believed that the brain was the cause of the soul, of thoughts and sensations. All ideas are corporeal, he wrote. Modern physicalism does not usually take such a simple view. Clearly there are experiences called thoughts, and they are not of the same nature as bricks or trees. Even so, they are products of the workings of our physical brains, the inner reflection of physical processes. Physicalist pantheists believe that we are not distinct from our bodies. We are our bodies, and our bodies are us. Some people believe that this approach debases human existence to the level of cells and molecules, but this is not the case. Thought is a property of matter/energy that emerges only with very high levels of organization, and in any case, cells and molecules are awesome, so there is no question of debasing. The human brain is the most complex structure we know of in the whole universe. It has an estimated 100 billion neurons, as many as there are stars in a galaxy. Each one has some 10,000 links to others, making perhaps 1 quadrillion linkages in all, a 1 with 15 zeros after it. Equally, matter/energy, as understood by modern science, is vibrant, mysterious, wonderful stuff. It is very different indeed from Newton's idea of hard little balls bumping around, and from Plato's idea of matter as a chaotic and base raw material waiting for divine ideas to shape it. In modern physics, matter is interchangeable with energy. It is ceaselessly in motion and infinitely creative in the forms it throws up, like bubbles in a lake of lava. If human brains and all their thoughts, from Buddha to Einstein, are manifestations of matter, then matter is more wonderful than most people have ever imagined. End quote. So that was a little bit longer of a section, but I like it a lot. He's talking about physicalist pantheism. So he splits it off into 3 parts here, and we can largely dismiss idealist pantheism, that everything is a product of mind. That's like an Eastern philosophy thing, and I don't think that really equals pantheism as I understand it. So I would dismiss that outright, to be honest, as a common belief in the Western world. But he also talks about dualist pantheism, which is much more common, which is the belief that there's souls or spirit in the world, that you have a soul and you're not just matter, that there's some sort of divine spark of a soul in people that is separate from just matter. And then set against that is physicalist pantheism, which really comes down to say, no, there is just matter and matter/energy, and that's all. And everything is some formation of that. And that's where the author comes down on that particular side of things, if you read, the end where he kind of puts forward his own personal opinions on these controversies in the last chapter. But that's where he comes down. That's where I come down as well. It's a very materialistic world. So this brings about something else that needs to be discussed, which is he's talking about matter. But we've already talked about the universe, and we've also brought up nature in the very beginning when he defined it as nature is my God. So we've got a couple different things, and they're not exactly the same. Nature and matter and the universe. They don't mean the exact same thing. Like the universe is made of matter. So matter is kind of, in my eyes, more fundamental than the universe. The universe is made out of matter. But it's fundamental, like, in what way? And here's where something else has to come up, which is it's a fundamental to reality. What's reality? Matter exists in reality. Reality is the domain in which we're measuring these things. Matter is in reality. It is real. It exists. So matter exists in reality, and the universe is made out of matter. So if you're looking for like a sort of primordial fundamental qualities, I think there's a bit of a hierarchy. The most fundamental primordial thing is reality, and then there is matter, which exists in reality, and then there's the universe, which is comprised of matter. And so are all three of these things, or also there's nature. And what is nature? What does that mean? And where does that fit into this hierarchy? And those questions need to be sort of answered definitionally if we're going to say what pantheism is and what it reveres and what if it sets above other things, if it sets things above other things. Is there this hierarchy in reality? Is there a hierarchy of things that are like, is the fact that reality is, I think, the most fundamental of these things I've mentioned, does that make it the most worthy of reverence? Do we most of all worship reality more than, say, matter or the universe or nature? That's an important question that I'm going to look in further at some other things in here. And there's a whole bunch of divisions that keep popping up. Like, are you a monist or are you a dualist? Which of these four concepts that comprise elements of pantheism are prior, if any? Okay, let's jump to the next section. All right, so in this section, he's talking more where I think he kind of expresses most absolutely where he comes down on the side of monism versus dualism. He really plants his flag on the monism side of the fence. He says, quote, "We are all part of the same universal community. We are not insignificant. Each one of us is just as much a part of the totality as a venerable old tree or a bright star. The pantheist God is the community of all beings. It is not a he or a she or an it. It is a we, and a we in the broadest and most inclusive sense, embracing everything from rocks and algae through butterflies and humans to suns and planets. The major Western religions are all monotheistic. They all insist on the unity of God, though in the Christian sense this unity has also to accommodate the Trinity. Pantheists, too, are, in a sense, monotheistic. Their one focus of reverence is the universe, and they have a profound belief in the unity of all things in nature and the universe. Indeed, the pantheist belief in unity is stronger than the theistic one. Theists believe that God and the universe are at least in part separate and distinct things. For pantheists, there is only one all-embracing reality, the universe. Some pantheists have simply asserted this unity. Others, like Spinoza, have tried to prove it logically. But the unity of the universe and nature is not just a feeling or an abstract belief. It has a solid basis in science. Everything in our universe shares a common origin. The standard Big Bang cosmology holds that the whole universe originated as a microscopic bubble many times less than 1/100th of a millimeter across. Thus, everything that makes up the universe today was once in the most intimate contact. As Italian novelist Italo Calvino wrote in his comic short story All at One Point, every point of each of us coincided with every point of each of the others. Unity is not just based on a shared history, it continues throughout the present. Every single particle, every star, every being in the universe is linked by the force of gravity. A quasar on the edge of the observable universe has some effect, however small, on each of our bodies. The whole universe is a tightly woven mesh of electromagnetic radiation, and everything transmutes into everything else. The day before yesterday, we were atoms in the heart of a burning star. Yesterday, we were dust in a collapsing protostar. Today, we are living beings. Tomorrow, we may be soil, beetles, grass, trees, birds. Some idealist pantheists, like Parmenides of Elea or the authors of the Upanishads, have taken the idea of unity to extremes and suggest that nothing really exists except the divine unity. All the everyday things we see around us, they suggest, are really just illusions. Most modern-day pantheists are realists. They accept that individual things, tables, cats, moons, and so on, exist independently of our minds. Although nothing is exactly the same, even from one moment to the next, individual things do have a temporary existence, which can be very long in human terms. Such is the creativity of matter that every single thing is different from every other. No two people are the same, no two snowflakes are alike, no two pebbles on the beach are identical. Without individuality, the universal unity would be utterly drab, and could have no more beauty than an empty room. Yet all these individual things are part of the same universe, just as on the ocean every wave is different and partly separate, yet every wave remains part of the same ocean. End quote. So he really talks, that whole chapter, that whole section that I read, is called the pantheist concept of unity. And he's just talking about how important it is for pantheism, or for his understanding of pantheism, that this unity of all things, must be asserted. And he makes some concession to the existence of the separate things, but all that stuff seems like it's a concession is exactly what it is. He's like, okay, I understand that it's not all just one, like Parmenides says, it's not all the way to that pole of monism, but it's, that's really the most important part of it, or maybe he's saying that's what makes it sacred. That's what makes it so worthy of reverence, is the unity of the whole thing. He just really asserts that. And he even talks about like a quasar at the end of the universe. Even a quasar at the end of the universe has some effect on you. But what I would say is, if you think about a quasar at the other edge of the universe, like, you wouldn't just make a concession that, yes, although you and the quasar are different, you're really part of the same thing, because I would say that the most defining qualities, if you were to think about the relationship between me and a quasar at the edge of the universe, like the most prominent and defining qualities of that relationship is one of separation and distance. And although you might be able to find some scrap of influence, the real influence would probably be utterly immeasurable. Conceptually it might exist, but it's utterly immeasurable, and probably will never be measurable. It seems like it's probably I don't know what the future holds, but it just seems like such an insignificant actual effect on me. And it's like, even the closest object in the universe other than the Earth is the moon, and the moon is incredibly distant from me. I'll never walk on the moon, and it's taken all of the history of life on Earth to get anybody to the moon. It's like the universe, and that's just like the absolute closest thing among all the billions of things in the universe. So the universe is really defined in a way by separation and distance. So it's not the case that the unity of all things has to be so deeply prioritized, in my opinion. But that's him coming down on the side of the monism. But I'm going to move forward here to another section. Same chapter? No, this is chapter 5, when he talks about sacred nature. And what is nature? So we talked about these things: universe, matter, reality, nature. And what is I think we understand what reality is everything that exists and the fact that it exists. The fact of existence, I think, combined with the what of existence is reality. Just the what of existence is matter. The shape of the matter, I think, is the universe. And what is nature? So, in this section, he says, quote, rainforests are being felled at the rate of 15 million hectares every year, an area 3 times the size of Denmark. The oceans are polluted and overfished. Coral reefs are dying in every region of the globe. The Earth's protective ozone layer is weakened, and global warming could bring rising seas and rapid climate change. All these human-induced changes threaten us and every other species on Earth. Today, we are living through the greatest mass extinction of species since the end of the dinosaurs. Under these new conditions, the old biblical and agrarian attitude of human mastery over nature is no longer helpful. Even those religions that have not so far placed great value on nature are now coming to see humans not as masters but as stewards of this earth, with a responsibility to be kind to animals and to conserve nature. Pantheism goes further than this and sees us as members of the natural community, with a duty to behave as responsible members and to offer restitution for the damage we have done. Our unity with nature. Just as pantheism sees the universe as a unity, it sees all nature on Earth as a complex interacting whole. The unity is not just a belief or a warm feeling inside, it is scientific fact. All living creatures on Earth are branches of a single tree. The higher apes are our brothers and sisters in this extended family. We share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but even the lowest bacterium is a distant cousin, sharing some of our genes inherited from the first living cells. All life on Earth shares a common origin. Whether it all started in some warm little pond, as Charles Darwin imagined, in underwater volcanic vents, or from building blocks brought in on comets or dust from space. Our unity with nature is not just a matter of history, but a present reality that is continually renewed. Species do not exist in isolation. They live in communities, in ecosystems. Every species involved in relation to every other part of its ecosystem. Each has its own special niche or way of life, at least a little different from every other, to give all a better chance of survival. Many species have evolved in relation to their prey or predators, as well as to their competitors. Many have come to depend on each other for pollination, seed dispersal, protection, and many other mutual services. Every habitat, from a pine forest to a pond, is a community, with complex cycles in which different life forms play their role. Plants create material from light, water, air, and soil. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat herbivores. Finally, detrivores live by breaking down dead matter or excreta left by the others and turning it into soil or fertilizer. All the members of one habitat make up a community. They share the same home. They depend on each other in life and in death. End quote. Okay, so he's talking about nature as really plants and animals, right? Life forms on Earth other than human, including humans. We said we're part of nature. But I think there's something here that I don't know if he's like explicitly getting at, but when we're asking the question of what is nature, we have to acknowledge that like there's a difference between a virgin forest and Times Square. If you're out in the forest, you're out in nature. But if you're walking down a city street, you're not out in nature in the same way. So nature has, and you know, the word nature is used by many people in many different ways, but for my purposes, I would consider there's a difference between the virgin forest and Times Square. That if you're in an area that has not been processed by people, but is the way that it would be on the earth absent our influence, then that's nature. All the other life forms and all the things just as they're created by natural processes. That's nature. And then we process things, and although it's still matter, it's not nature in the same way. And so I would say that it becomes equipment. Matter processed by human artifice is equipment. It's a different form of matter. My table, my microphone, my computer, the glass of water, everything around me in my house is equipment of one form or another. It's not nature, although it's natural in the sense that it's not supernatural. But I would say that what that really means is that it's matter, as opposed to like some immaterial thing. So that, I think, gives me a good definition of nature to fit it in with the other three things that are in some form or another worthy of reverence. So they're really like fourfold, and I think partly like where you fall on the dispersal of which of those you prioritize is going to have an impact on whether you're a monist or a dualist, because matter of those is most of all is that which is many. Matter exists in multiple little atoms, and the many things around me are all material things. So the universe is a little bit more distant from me. It's not as immediate to me, and reality itself is very monistic, but that's not as immediate to me either. Even though I might say it's very primordial, is it immediate? I think matter is the most immediate thing, and so in a way it should be prioritized. But there's also a question of whether or not you're prioritizing matter as matter in that which you hold in highest reverence, or nature. And if you're prioritizing nature over equipment, and to what degree? Because if you're like prioritizing nature over equipment in absolute degree, then you're advocating for like an absolute return to an animal state. So there's some degree of equipment and processing that has to happen. So we have to make concessions to like other forms of matter and other forms of life. So what are we making concessions toward in that state? And why do we want to not revert to an absolute animal state? What is it about civilization that and like equipment and separation from pure nature that we find appealing, or that we are pursuing? Why are we pursuing the separation from nature in that way? So those are more questions that need to be discussed and answered as we define what pantheism is and identify what I think are some very clear separations in the different branches or potential understandings of pantheism. So moving on from there, I guess this is the last section that I want to read here, and this begins to address like why we step away from nature in the way that I just described, and what the difference is between prioritizing that nature and the degree to which people prioritize that nature and what that means. So here we look at nature as set against justice. And in a previous episode, I had talked about the potential of considering nature as unjust. The things which exist in nature, by nature, through no human artifice, could they be defined as unjust? Is that possible? Is it possible for nature to be an injustice? And do we want to rectify that? So this kind of touches on that a little bit. So in this section, he says, quote, "In pantheism, the universe as a whole is regarded as the principal focus of deepest reverence. It is seen as a unity, and all things are part of the unity. This means that every natural thing is an integral member of the focus of reverence. Every natural thing is one spark that goes to make up the whole fire. If we revere the fire, we are obliged to respect and cherish the sparks that make it up. Obviously, humans are more complex than most other organisms, more capable of more definite types of purposive action, but as far as our fundamental relation to the universe is concerned, humans are not superior to animals, nor animals to plants, nor plants to rocks or clouds or streams. All natural things are on the same level. We are all parts of a single whole, a vast community of being." And then he goes on to say, quote, "These principles dictate that we should regard all life forms with the deepest respect and compassion. They were not put here for us to use or abuse. They evolved in their own right, and they exist for their own benefit. Applied to animals, these principles mean that we must try to avoid imposing pain or distress on animals. We must try, as far as possible, to allow them to fulfill their natural needs and to express their natural instincts. Many pantheists take these ideas to their final conclusion and become vegetarians, avoiding all meat, or even vegans, avoiding all dairy products. However, others argue that our nearest relatives, chimpanzees, and most aboriginal human societies hunt and eat animals, so it cannot be unnatural for humans to do so. Humans also have rights, of course, and sometimes those rights conflict with those of other species, just as they do in the case of predator and prey, herbivore and herb, or parasite and host. As a minimum, we need food, shelter, and clothing. It can be argued that to gain these, we have the same rights as other animals to take what we need. Sometimes this may mean taking other animals' lives or taking over their living space. But when we do, we should do so only for vital reasons and with full respect for the creatures, just as Native Americans honor and ask forgiveness of the animals they hunt. And we should do so in a way that minimizes the suffering for these animals and all others. End quote. Okay, so now begins talking about how, animals have rights and all living things have rights and people have rights and, we shouldn't cause undue suffering to animals. And I largely agree with everything he says here. But you've got to ask the question when he starts, he says humans also have rights. But I never quite understand what he means by rights, or what any writer or thinker means by rights. It's not always really clearly stated. A lot of people say that our rights come from God, people who are theists. And if the world is just matter, if that's really everything that there is the physicalist perspective and all there is matter, then what is a right? Where does it come from? By what parameters would you say and define what a right is or is not? And there are all kinds of assertions about what is a right. And is it really anything more than just an assertion that you have the capacity to back up? If you say, I have a right to this, but then in reality, you have no capacity of acquiring that thing that you have a right to, how could it be a right? And is it possible that, all entities would have their rights fulfilled? Is such a world in which rights are never violated possible? And if it's not possible, then don't we live in a reality that is inherently unjust? I think that part of the reason, if we were to just say we're going to totally revert to an animal state, wouldn't there be all sorts of things that would occur that we would currently define as violations of rights and injustices? And so you have to draw the conclusion from that there's a difference between a state of nature and a state of justice. What is a state of justice and where does that premise come from? And do we pursue justice at the expense of nature? And to what extent do we pursue justice at the expense of nature? I think that those are really important questions. I think that it's hard to define what justice is. Much has been written about it. I'm not sure I could come up with a good definition. It might have something to do with rights, but what are rights? What is any of that stuff? These are questions that need to be further explored, and I don't think that I'm going to answer that question in this episode. But it's certainly stuff to think about. I have a number of disagreements, I think I pointed out, with the author of this book. I'm more of a pluralist. I think that I mostly prioritize... we looked at 5 things, really, that would come into balance of prioritization. Reality, matter, the universe, nature, justice. All these things are weighed against one another in terms of what we value most. And is it reasonable or possible to prioritize one of those to the exclusion of the others? Or do they all have to exist in some sort of a balance where we have a multiplicity of values that are balanced against one another? What is the measure by which we determine what the balance should be? What is our objective? All right. Bunch of questions, not a lot of answers. I'll see you next time.